Hello, this is Tom Chambers for Pokersavvy.com. This is the second video in my 8 video PLO Fundamentals series. The first video was a core concepts video. We talked about a lot of general ideas that are important in playing PLO, particularly helpful to people transitioning from other games, specifically No Limit Hold'em. This video is going to be focused on pre-flop strategy, so we're going to extend some of the concepts from that core concepts video, ideas about relative hand strength and sort of what types of post-flop situations different hands prefer, and we'll sort of expand on some of those ideas, particularly talking about the distribution of equities, sort of looking at a pre-flop hand in terms of the distribution of situations, distribution of equities that it flops, and sort of how that determines what the best pre-flop play is in a lot of situations. So we're gonna cover a broad range of ideas in the first sort of 2/3 of this video, and then the last slide is set up to give me an opportunity to talk about ranges from different positions, ranges from early position, late position, ranges facing a raise both in and out of position, and also a little bit about facing a 3-bet, 4-betting and or calling 3-bets. But the majority of the video, the first half hour, 45 minutes, is going to be focused on sort of communicating some concepts that would expect that you would be able to then apply into sort of making decisions about individual hands. It's pretty hard in PLO, as you might imagine, with so many different hand possibilities, to come up with a straight pre-flop starting hands chart. And although things like that can be done, it's not something that's really doable within the time frame that we have here. So mostly we're just going to be talking about some general concepts, general ideas, and sort of hope to be able to translate those, hope that you'll be able to translate those as you play. Okay, so here are the 3 key components of a starting hand. High card strength, basically just the ability to flop pairs, 2-pair sets. Connectedness, the ability to flop straights and straight draws, and suitedness, clearly the ability to flop flush draws and flushes. You can look at any given starting hand as sort of having some combination of these 3 characteristics. A hand like ace, king, king, rainbow is not connected, not suited, but has a lot of high card strength. It's able to make top set 2 different ways, and will flop top set something like just under 25% of the time. A hand like jack 10, 9, 8 rainbow doesn't have any suitedness, doesn't have much high card strength. It can obviously flop a pair, and a pair can be part of a combo hand, pair plus draw hand that's good, but clearly it doesn't get much value from that. It's almost entirely getting its value from its ability to make straights and straight draws, and so forth. There's lots of examples. We'll look at some more, look at these ideas in some more concrete terms further down the line. But those are the 3 main things that you look for in a starting hand. The ability to make, and with respect to high card strength, it's basically the ability, in Omaha, it's the ability to make top 2 or better. Anything worse than top 2 is, like, going back to the first video in the series, that's a piece of minor equity. It functions as a blocker. It functions as a sort of extra outs against somebody, potential to have a slight edge against somebody who has a similar draw, where you have a pair plus draw and you dominate them. Sometimes it'll be a dominating situation. Sometimes it'll just be a few pieces of equity, a few percentage points of equity. Sometimes it'll be a blocker versus a set. Sometimes it'll be so small pieces of equity. And similarly with connectedness, once you get below like a 13 wrap, you've got 13 wraps, 17 wraps, 20 wraps, nut straights. These are all obviously very strong hands that are valuable on their own. Anything weaker than that, open-enders, gut shots, and so forth, those are potentially pieces of equity that you can add to other components, but that if you only have, we're talking in post-flop terms mostly now, if you only have sort of just the gut shot, obviously it's not worth much. And similarly with suitedness, a nut flush draw, a nut flush, worth a lot by itself. Non-nut flush draws, non-nut flush, non-nut suits pre-flop are worth something as sort of an addition to other hand strength. And as we sort of transition these ideas back to, I've been talking in terms of the sort of the post-flop hand strengths that different hands will make, but you think about pre-flop starting hands. A hand like 9, 8, 7, 6 double suited is very connected. It's going to flop a decent number of strong straight draws and straights, and it does have the suitedness sort of as an additional side piece of equity, but you're not going to flop nut flush draws. You're going to be using that suitedness when you have when you've also flopped, you flop a wrap plus a flush draw, flop a pair plus a wrap plus a flush draw. That's when those non-nut suits are going to be most valuable to you. So that 9 high suit is worth a lot more if you have a hand like 9-8-7-6 than it is if you have a hand like, I don't know, Jack 9-4-2, where you're basically never going to be able to realize the equity from a 9 high flush draw. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about some more sort of theory ideas about hand strength. There's some key elements of hand strength. We've got these this concept of flop equity distribution we talked about a lot last time in the first video, and if you want a further explanation of some of these ideas, of this particular idea, you can go back there and review a longer section of that video where I talked about it. But sort of reminder of the general concept: there are some hands that are very strong sometimes, very weak other times, and sort of derive most of their value from their top 10% or so of flops. And the archetype case for this is King 7 deuce rainbow, which either flops top set or flops basically nothing, and there isn't much in between. So this is a polarized equity distribution. Really smooth equity distribution, the double suited, double connected hand, Queen Jack 10-9 is the example given here. It has a really smooth transition from its very strong flops to its good flops to its medium strength flops and so on. And then there's a bunch of intermediate cases between. We talked about them a little bit more in the previous video, but I'm going to move on for now. Talk about a second way of looking at a starting hand. Second way of looking at hand strength is the mix of component strengths. And so we talked about the suitedness, high card strength, and connectedness, and sort of some starting hands are defined by single strong component without any backup. So you're looking at dry pocket kings, 10-9-8-7 rainbow, a dry suited ace, which basically each of these hands does one thing well, and it does do that one thing pretty well. Makes a nut flush, flops a lot of straights, flops top set, but doesn't have anything else going for it. Then there's single strong component hands with mediocre backup. So this is, you add a suit to the rainbow hands, you add some minor connectedness plus a second suit to the nut flush hand, but other than sort of some very minor additional equity that you can pick up there, a few extra flops that you like, mostly you're just looking at that single strong component hand. Both of these hand types are hands that are playable, and in fact I'm listing the 5 categories here, are sort of describing the 5 types of hands, or one way of looking at hands, splitting them into 5 groups of playable hands. There are certainly other hands out there that are single component hands that are pretty weak, like a 7-7-4-9, 9-7-4-4, or whatever, those types of hands, which could be put into another category along these lines, but they're not playable, so we just sort of leave them off. The multiple component hands, if you've got a sort of the really strong Omaha hand, is a hand that's really good at doing more than one thing. So ace, Jack 10 double suited, it's connected, it's double suited, it's got high card strength, can make top set. Obviously the overpair plus draw value is strong, so it's got a decent amount of pair value coming from the aces and from the post flop value of the aces, particularly when it has these good side cards. And then the double suited King Queen Jack 10 is of course another example. You got hands that have multiple decent components. A Jack 10-9. It's got a 3-card connected combination that's pretty strong. It's got a pocket pair that's good but doesn't always flop top set. Is going to get in some tricky spots with middle set, with sets on boards where as straight as possible and so forth. Although usually in this case it would have that straight. And then also we've got this Ace Queen Jack 9. And the Jack 10-9 only has one suit, and it's only it's a non-nut suit. Ace Queen Jack 9 is a bit disconnected. It can't flop a set, but obviously can flop top 2 and pair plus in a bunch of different ways. But doesn't have that much straight potential, a little bit, but not too much. The ace and the 9 actually kind of block each other there, so it's less connected than it looks. And only a single suit, but a nut suit. And so this is a pretty strong hand, example of a pretty strong hand, and it's a hand that's balanced across the two or three different of the 3 components, but without sort of being just totally dominating in any one direction. And then you've got hands that are sort of multiple mediocre component hands, such as 8-7-7-6 double suited. Double suitedness is great, but you have 2 non-nut suits. Not even just non-nut, but 2 low suits, where the suit itself is not adding that much. It's nice that there's 2 of them. It's nice that it's that it's accompanying a hand that can hit flops in other ways, so that the suitedness value will actually come through some. But mostly it's it's still kind of mediocre, the suitedness aspect of the hand. The pocket pair, it's a pair of sevens is not, you're generally flopping bottom set or middle set, and you run into some domination problems and reverse implied odds problems. And again, a 3-card connected combination is solid, but it's not going to flop a ton of wraps. It's only going to flop so many, flop a straight 3 or 4% of the time. This is a very strong sort of version of a multiple mediocre component hand, but it still doesn't really crush in any one direction. And so there are other hands that fall into this category, some of them better than others, and we'll talk a little bit more about sort of in what situations different hands are playable. But that's, in addition to this flop equity distribution idea, another way we can try to break things down without having to sort of think in terms of really just the frequencies of how often hands flop different things, which can be somewhat complicated to think through. Just look at the hand and say, this hand does, of these 3 things, this hand does this thing well, it does it really well, then it's a single strong component type hand. And start thinking about situations in which you want to play, what do you want to do with the fact that you have a hand like King, King, 7 deuce rainbow? What situations is it best suited towards? So we're going to get into that a little bit more in the next few minutes. Final section of sort of key elements of hand strength is nuttiness, and we have this separation of starting hands into these 3 groups. There are some hands that are mostly nut making hands. Now these could be great hands, these could be mediocre hands, could be sort of somewhere in between, could even be a really weak hand that is a nutty hand that really makes the nuts in one way but doesn't do it very often, and so it's not even a playable hand. There are some hands that fall into that category, like a really crappy suited ace, something like that. But here we have King, King, 7 deuce rainbow, Ace 8, 7, 6 with a suited ace. These are hands that, Queen, Jack, 10, 9 rainbow. These are hands that mostly make the nuts when they make a good hand. And so the question, when they make a good hand, how often they're making those nut hands is obviously going to make the difference between being a good hand, starting hand, or a great starting hand. Like Ace, Ace, Jack, 10 double suited, again, makes the nuts a bunch of different ways, and 2 nut flush draws, 2 nut flushes, nut straights, nut sets. It's a very, very strong hand, and it's a very nutty hand. But it's clearly King, King, 7 deuce rainbow is just as nutty, although it's not as it's not as strong because it doesn't flop top set as often as Ace, Ace, Jack, 10 double suited flops all of the good stuff it can flop. You've got at the bottom end, you've got hands that mostly make the non-nuts, non-nut draws. You've got that 8, 7, 7, 6 double suited hand again, 10, 7, 5, 4 double suited. Here we've got hands that are going to flop a few different decent things, but are almost never going to have the nuts. And that doesn't mean that they're necessarily bad hands. It just means that they're hands that we have to think about sort of how to play in order to take advantage of, or to avoid the disadvantage of not having nuttiness, or sort of to minimize that negative. Clearly, it's always better to have a hand that can make the nuts than one that can't, but some of these sort of medium strength non-nutty hands are good because they make a lot of different non-nut things. A good example of that would be a Jack 10, 9, 8 double suited. It has nuttiness in terms of connectedness, but it's also going to be flopping a lot of non-nut flush draws. It's going to be flopping a lot of sort of non-nut pair plus draw combinations. But because it's flopping hands of that strength so often, it's a very good hand, and the question just becomes, what do we want to do to play it in order to take advantage of its strengths, as opposed to a hand like Ace 8, 7, 6 double suited, which wants to play to its strengths of being a nut making hand. All right, in order to answer the question, the questions, what do we do with this information? How do we, given that we can think about starting hands in these ways, how do we turn that into a decision process for making pre-flop decisions? Which hands do we want to 3-bet? Which hands do we want to flat call? It seems like we're taking a while to get to those answers, but there's a reason for it. It takes the development of some concepts before we can really understand why we're going to be doing what I advise you to do. So I'm going to move forward to this next section, key parameters of a post-flop situation. And the reason that we jump from defining the sorts of things we're looking for with starting hands to talking about post-flop again is that what we want to do with our starting hand decisions, our pre-flop decisions, is set ourselves up for the best possible post-flop situations. And so there are a total of, or more than just these 3 what I'm calling parameters of a post-flop situation is just sort of the conditions that define what type of situation we're in. And there are more things than just that. Once we get to post-flop play, when you're looking at flop decisions, turn decisions, and so forth, there are more things than just position, number of opponents, and stack to pot ratio that matter. Board texture, the opponent tendencies in terms of how often they do different things on the flop and the turn and so forth. But with respect to pre-flop play, we can really zero in on these three things, at least as far as defining a default pre-flop strategies. So you've got position, number of opponents, stack to pot ratio. We're going to focus in on those three things and going to say a few things about which hands we prefer to have with respect to in different situations with respect to each of these parameters. So with respect to position, we can either be in position or out of position. It's a pretty basic distinction. And the generalization I want to make is that the hands that are relatively easier to play when out of position are hands that will often have the nuts or nothing on turns and rivers, that will flop strong nut draws, strong nut hands, or flop air. If you're looking at, obviously, you would prefer to be flopping, you would prefer to have a monster and, a hand like, again, ace, ace, jack, 10 double suited, ace, king, jack, 10 double suited, those types of hands that are flopping nut stuff a lot. But if you're making a decision between two different types of marginal hands and saying, do I want to play this hand out of position or not, I think that you should be, one of the things you should be relying on is whether the hand is nutty, and whether the hand has a select percentage of flops, maybe the top 5, top 10, top 15% of its flops, that it hits really hard. And so these are the hands that are relatively easier to play when out of position. Nothing is easy to play out of position. If you flop the nuts, you're not going to make as much money from it out of position as you would in position on average. If you make, flop huge nut draws, etc., it's going to be tougher to profitably play them for all different sorts of reasons. But if you're forced to be out of position and have some kind of a medium strength hand, you would much prefer that it be a hand that can make the nuts. Hands that benefit most from position, you sort of flip this and you see that there are these multiple mediocre component hands, thinking back to the 8-7-7-6 double suited, the Jack 9-8-6 double suited, hands like that. Non-nut making hands in general, and weak or intermediate hands. So any hands that sort of are going to end up with a lot of medium strength pair plus draws sort of stuff. Generally speaking, if you have 2 pair plus, if you have nut straight draws, nut flush draws, nut flushes, these types of hands are pretty easy to play both in and out of position. It's just a matter of sort of maximizing value and making relatively easy pot odds based decisions. What's trickier to do is to, in general, regardless of whether you're in or out of position, is play the sort of medium strength pair plus draw, open-ender plus middle pair, non-nut flush draw plus top pair, stuff like that. And if you're consistently playing hands out of position, starting hands out of position that put you in those spots a lot, you're going to be bleeding a lot of money. Whereas if you're in position with those hands, you're going to be able to make good decisions. You're going to have the option to either semi-bluff, double barrel the turn, or check behind the turn, and you're going to have more information when you're making that decision versus being out of position and having to decide before you see what your opponent's done on the turn what you want to do, and being susceptible to him checking behind when you go for check raises and all kinds of stuff. So it's getting into probably a little bit more post-flop complications than I wanted to today, but there's this basic idea that it is easier to play mediocre stuff in position should be pretty straightforward, and so the result of this is that if we think back to the list of different types of hands or the things that we're looking for in hands, non-nut making hands are much more comfortable it's much more comfortable to play them cut off and button. And there are a lot of sort of seemingly good looking non-nut hands like Jack 8-6-5 double suited that are folds under the gun and folds from the blinds, and that don't necessarily sort of although they are very nice looking hands, they're the kind of hands that you can 3-bet from the button, kind of hands that you always will open from the button, call a 3-bet if you're in position, all this kind of stuff. They're hands that suffer a lot when they're out of position in a 3-way pot, and all of the stuff that they can flop that's pretty good, the best stuff that they can flop is non-nut pair plus draw and so forth. All right, we'll move on to second of these parameters, the number of opponents. Again, we're making big generalizations here, but this is this is always the place to start from. Big generalizations, you can sort of filter down to individual decisions. Hands that prefer pure players are sort of any non-nut hands, any multiple decent component hands, hands that are sort of balanced across a range of situations, and that sort of will have a sort of, thinking back to the idea of the distribution of equities, hands that are sort of relatively smooth distribution of, have a relatively smooth distribution of equities. Your Jack 9-8-6 double suited hand, again, this hand would prefer to be heads up versus in a 4-5 way pot, because in a 4-5 way pot, nuttiness becomes more important. In a 4-5 way pot, the ability to hammer a flop really hard becomes more important. And in a single raised pot, all of that sort of medium strength stuff is more playable. Now, clearly, going back to the previous slide, you would also prefer to be in position. Heads up in position with that hand is better than heads up out of position. But if we're just looking at the number of opponents and saying which one do we prefer, we would prefer fewer players with those non-nutty hands, would prefer more players with the nuttier, strong single component hands. Hands like King, King, 7 deuce, rainbow, hands like Ace 8, 6, 5, single suited to the ace. Those types of hands, because they can make the nuts, because they're strong in one direction, they have a strong, 10% or so, 10, 15% of flops. Those are hands that want multi-way pots, want to encourage people with sort of weaker hands in that direction to come in. You have King, King, 7 deuce, rainbow. You want to play pots with people with pocket 9s, pocket 8s, pocket 7s, so that you can set them. That's where you get a lot of your value. With non-nut, with sort of just the nut flush draw, essentially, dry suited ace, you want to encourage action from suited queens, suited kings, and so forth in order to get that implied odds value from your nuts over near nut situations. And the more players in the pot, the more likely it is that you get that situation. Last one of these is stack to pot ratio. And you may notice at this point that there's sort of a trend among these hand types that these three ideas work together: position, number of opponents, and SPR. And they're going to lead towards making some recommendations about which hands to 3-bet, which hands to flat call, and so forth. But hands that like single raise pots, for similar reasons to why these hands like multi-way pots, are polarized hands, such as King, King, 7 deuce, rainbow. There's a couple things going on with that hand. One is that if you 3-bet with it, or if you find yourself in a 3-bet pot with King, King, 7 deuce, rainbow, there's really no difference between here's how we can say this: the top 10 to 15% of flops where it flops a set, flops where it flops like trip 7s or trip deuces, I guess, but basically just flops where it flops a set of kings. Those flops are very strong regardless. Those flops are strong in a multi-way single raised pot. You're going to set over set people, etc. Those hands are obviously very strong in a 3-bet pot. When you go from a single raised pot to a 3-bet pot, though, you need to go from that sort of top 10 or 15% of flops to maybe the top 25, 30% of flops. And the problem with dry kings is that it doesn't really easily transition. It's that polarized distribution that means that sort of as soon as you get to as soon as you get past the flops where you flop a set, the top 15% or so, King, King, 7 deuce, rainbow just drops off a cliff in terms of its post-flop value. It turns into a dry overpair, and that's it. And you would much prefer to have that type of a hand benefits more from sort of focusing itself on the pots where it's going to get most value for its top 10%. And so that's, again, going for set over set, going for multi-way pots where you can get good action and only have to worry about getting the money in, playing for stacks, the 10 or 15% of the time. If you get into a 3-bet, 4-bet pot, you're going to be sort of committed because of the amount of money already in the pot pre-flop to putting more money in post-flop than you would want with dry overpairs, so forth. And so connected to this is the implied odds point, which is if you have pocket kings on the button and somebody raises in front of you, and you could 3-bet and isolate them and get a heads-up pot with dry pocket kings, or you could call and let the 2 blinds come in with pocket 9s and pocket 10s, obviously you would much prefer to get into the multi-way pot where you can flop set over set. So anyway, that's the overall reason that these nutty polarized hands tend to like single raised pots. And we're also sort of talking about hands with everything polarized hands, nutty hands, and hands that are balanced across different components are less likely to be polarized nutty hands. So a hand like a King, King, 7 deuce, rainbow, it does one thing really well. It's got high card strength, the ability to flop a set, and that's it. And sort of by the very nature of as a result of that, it ends up being a hand that has a polarized equity distribution, and that is basically a nutty hand that wants that needs someone to be in the pot with it to flop the second nuts, third nuts, and then pay it off. So that's the hands that like single raise pots. Hands that like re-raise pots are first hands with a smooth distribution of equities. These are the hands that find it easy to hit significantly more flops hard. What the exact number should be in a pot with 10% of your stack in 20, 25, 30, who knows. You're going to be wanting to stack off a good bit more than 10% of the time. And you're going to be wanting to sort of have the ability to flop a wider range of stuff than top set or dry overpair. And so these are where your double suited hands come into play. Strong sort of high card double suited hands, Queen Jack 10-9 double suited Broadway, big connected pocket pairs and so forth. These are the obvious hands to 3-bet. And when you're in position and looking to 3-bet lighter, hands that are smoother are the hands that you go to first to 3-bet light with. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later when we get into talking about ranges. But the basic idea, the basic sort of theme here should be clear, that hands like King, King, 7 deuce rainbow, they're single component hands. They make the nuts, but not that often, relatively speaking. And they benefit from having a lot of opponents in the pot. A hand like Jack 10-9 8 double suited, for a few different reasons, benefits from having fewer opponents, from having more money in the pot pre-flop. And as long as it's a pretty strong version of this kind of hand, of course, just because you have a non-nut hand like 9-9 4 deuce double suited or something, clearly you're not going to start 3-betting those hands. But a hand that is profitable to 3-bet, if it has this characteristic that it has some non-nut components, a pretty smooth distribution of equities, then you would lean towards 3-betting with that hand pre-flop. So we have hands that benefit from promoting the value of weaker components by reducing the SPR. This is like non-nut suits. To some extent non-nut straight draw possibilities, but more it has to do with non-nut suits and having high cards that can now flop pair plus draw stuff that is worth more in a 3-bet pot. In a single raise pot, top pair plus a flush draw is a pretty good hand, but not great. In a 3-bet pot, heads up, it's a monster. And when you have hands like double suited Broadways that flop those types of things a lot, then you're going to want to be in you're going to be happy to be in a 3-bet pot with them. So that's the rest of the SPR point. Now we're going to talk a little bit about some pre-flop hand groupings. And basically I've set these up to go down this list of sort of 9 subcategories of all the starting hands, and to try to talk a little bit about the different types of hands within them. You could break these down a lot further, and if you were to end up with sort of starting hand groupings that look like what Hold'em starting hand groupings look like in terms of the level of detail, you'd be looking at more than 100 different categories, and that's certainly not the kind of thing that we can get into in a 45-minute video. But I'm going to try to talk through unpaired rainbow, unpaired single suited, so forth down the line. These are basically just sort of 9 big categories we can put all the different starting hands into, and make some general comments about the kind of hands that fall into these categories, when they're playable, and so forth. So unpaired rainbow hands, right off the bat, thinking about our suitedness, connectedness, high card strength, they're not suited, clearly. They don't have that much in general high card strength, because the real hands that are sort of power hands in that direction are hands that can flop top set, second set, big pocket pair hands. And Broadway cards are obviously worth something with respect to high card strength, but the ability to flop top 2, if that's the best thing that you can do with your hand is flop top 2, then you're mostly looking at the other components of the hand as being more important. So particularly also with unpaired hands, this is a general statement about unpaired hands, is that when you have strong 1-pair, 2-pair stuff, you much prefer to have backup. And with a rainbow hand, you just don't have nearly as much backup possibility. You can only flop straight draws, you can't flop flush draws. So hands like ace, king, queen, jack, rainbow are playable, but they're a little bit tricky in that they don't have any connectedness, they don't have any suitedness. The one thing that they do pretty well, flop 1-pair, 2-pair, often is in trouble when it doesn't have backup, and we actually don't really have backup in those situations. So mostly what you're looking for when you're playing unpaired rainbow hands is the ability to flop straights, connectedness, and particularly you're sort of locked into those, not just the good flops where you flop straights and wraps, but really it's only the rainbow flops where you flop straights and wraps that are strong for you, because anytime you flop a wrap on a flush draw board, when you can never be the one who has the flush draw with an unpaired with a rainbow hand. That takes away a significant slice of your good flops. So these are hands that are mostly going to be sort of hands to see a flop relatively cheap with, try to flop well, go from there. And they will hit a certain slice of flops really hard. So to some extent they're polarized, although they have like I think we talked about this in the first video, of a 3-tiered distribution. They got those really good flops that are rainbow. They got the same flops but with a flush draw, which are dangerous, and they got everything else. Some dry one pair type flops. We're talking about like 10, 9, 8, 7 rainbow and stuff like that. Some dryish one pair type flops, and then all the air flops. And the problem with this hand, and a reason why 10, 9, 8, 7 rainbow I would never advise 3-betting, is that you sort of, when you get into a 3-bet pot, you've generated a spot where you need lots of pair plus draw combinations, and you need to hit flops at that level. And when you don't have a suit, in order to sort of give that additional component value to your straight draws and so forth, you're just too often going to be on the bad end of a 60-40 on your really good flops. And so typically these are going to be hands that you want to see the flop for a single bet. You open them, the strong connected hands within this group. Majority of unpaired rainbow hands that aren't connected are just going to be folds from any position with any situation. You're really not getting enough. Without having the possibility of flopping flush draws, single suited, double suited hands, you're just not getting enough value. Unpaired single suited hands actually make up the majority of all starting hands, about 50% of them. And when you're looking at the sort of again, this suitedness, connectedness, high card strength, the one thing that we're adding now is the potential for a single flush draw, single suit, and suited aces, suited kings. Certainly are a significant additional piece of value. And so we look from going from those unpaired rainbow hands like ace king 8-7 rainbow and so forth, which is basically useless. A hand like ace king 8-7 single suited as an open in late position, an open really from, I guess, probably from under the gun +1 as well. Even though it's not really connected, it does have a little bit of high card strength, and it has that nut suit, which makes it playable. The unpaired double suited hands are this is the place where you really see some of those blended component hands. You see some of the sort of multiple mediocre component, multiple decent strong component hands. Obviously the strongest hands in this group are like the queen jack 10-9 double suited, the ace king queen jack double suited, and there's no question about what to do with those hands. You raise them, you re-raise them if you get the opportunity against most opponents, and you certainly are always going to be seeing a flop, and they're very good hands. It's hands like the jack 8-7-5 double suited that we talked about earlier. Those are hands that are very good to play in position, a little bit tougher to play out of position. Hands that I would advise folding under the gun, folding from the blinds, and being aggressive with on the cutoff and the button. I'm going to skip through the double paired hands pretty quickly because they really don't make up that much. Don't make up that many of the starting hands. It's like 1% overall. But double paired rainbow hands are clearly basically set draws. And if you've got a couple of big pairs, king, king, queen, queen is clearly a strong hand, but also one that has a very specific purpose if it's rainbow, and you're basically just going to set mine with it, and would recommend flat calling. As soon as you take a good hand like that, good double paired hand like that, pre-flop, single suited, double suited, you're going to be 3-betting that hand, and it's that extra pair plus draw value over pair plus flush draw value that comes with the extra suit, or even better, being double suited, that makes it a 3-bet versus a flat. As a general rule, I would say that I 3-bet very, very few rainbow hands ever, regardless of the rest of the components of the hand, just because the lack of a pair plus draw, or the many fewer pair plus draw, strong draw possibilities that you have, just not a great hand to have in a 3-bet pot. You want to focus in on sort of hitting those flops that it hits hard, and making sure that you see that really strong flop before you decide to commit a lot, because otherwise you're going to be too far ahead of your hand. Anyway, the double paired, double suited hands, especially sort of the big ones are obvious. You 3-bet king, king, queen, queen, double suited. You're very happy to play big pots with those hands pre-flop. But the 9-9-7-7 double suited and so forth, those hands can be really good light 3-bet hands, and the reason is that they flop something that is kind of mediocre in a single raised multi-way pot middle set. It's certainly, once you flop the middle set, you're usually going to be pretty happy to play for a lot of money post flop. The problem is that it does have some reverse implied odds problems. It could run into set over set, and you're not going to get nearly as much value out of it in a multi-way single raised pot. It's going to be trickier to play whether you're in or out of position. But if you 3-bet pre-flop with that hand and then you flop a set in a 3-bet pot, flopping a set is a monster. And so any set is a monster because everybody else is going to be aggressive with pair plus draw, as we just said. That's the type of hand that's good in a 3-bet pot. So the double paired hand is a really good hand to 3-bet with, especially when it has some connectedness and suitedness, which gives it a few extra flops to semi-bluff. And also, clearly, when you're 3-betting pre-flop, especially in position, you also have some pure bluff value. Your opponent's going to call the 3-bet and check fold a lot. So anyway, that's what has to be said about the double paired hands. Talking next few minutes about rainbow hands, about paired hands. Generally, your pocket pairs from like 9s down are mostly not worth much. You don't want to set mine to middle pairs. You don't want to set mine to middle set or bottom set. A pocket pair that's part of another sort of another well-balanced hand, a full balanced hand, 9, 9, 8, 7 double suited and so forth. Clearly these are good hands. And sets of 9s that you flop with that hand are going to be worth a lot. But you don't want to set mine to a set of 9s, to a set of 8s, to a set of 7s. So when you look at the Broadway pairs, mostly what you're going to focus on is that kings and queens are hands that when you set mine, you're set mining basically to top set majority of the time. Kings particularly flops top set like 80% of the time. It flops a set 85%, something like that. And queens not much less, still well more than 50%. When you look at jacks and 10s, these are the hands that you need to have a little bit more side card value to, particularly if you're going to be out of position. I would say that under the gun, we're going to talk about on the next slide. We're going to talk about sort of recommendations from different positions. Under the gun, I would say folding. It would be opening almost all of the pocket kings hands, opening a decent number of pocket queens hands, and not a ton of the jacks and 10s hands, but still some of them. And then once you get down to 9s, 8s, 7s, and so forth, under the gun, those hands are all folds. We're talking obviously 6 max. I assume that's been clear through this entire thing. But when you get into later position, you can be more comfortable raising hands that have jacks and 10s and even sometimes smaller pairs in them because you have positional advantage, and you're going to be able to, number one, play your non-nut sets better for better value and sort of make fewer mistakes with them. Number two, you're going to be able to bluff more successfully. But still, usually, if you have sort of anything less than pocket queens, you need to have some side card value in order to make the hand playable. Another way to think about this is that if you look at aces, kings, and queens, that makes up 7 or 8% of all starting hands right there. And so although it can be tempting to see a pocket pair and always try to set mine, altogether pocket pairs make up like a third of your hands. And so you think about how how loose you would have to be to always be set mining, and you would see that there's a significant difference between Omaha and Hold'em in that regard. You can't just see a pocket pair and think I'm going to try to flop a set. Generally speaking, the paired hands are not great in 3-bet pots as a sort of just that component of the hand. So dry pocket queens, queen, queen, 7 deuce rainbow is not a great hand, as we already said with the king's version of that hand. Not a great hand to 3-bet, and also sort of not a good hand to play in a 3-bet pot. If you get 3-bet by somebody who's competent and you got 100 BB stacks and you've got a dry pocket pair hand, you should be folding pre-flop. There's a lot of people who never fold the 3-bets pre-flop, but that's the exact sort of hand that just doesn't play well at all in a 3-bet pot. You don't want to set mine where that's all that you're doing in a 3-bet pot. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One is that you simply just don't flop a set often enough. The other problem is that compared with Hold'em, when you flop a set, you don't get as much money out of it. What I mean by that is simply that your average equity when you flop the set is not as strong as it is when you flop a set in Hold'em. A set of queens is a very strong hand, but your opponent's going to be a coin flip against you a lot of the time that you guys get stacks in, even in a 3-bet pot. There's lots of sets are a lot more vulnerable, and so drawing to a set is a bit sort of less valuable than it is in Hold'em. I think that's one of the, I don't usually do too much Hold'em examples, at least I try not to, but I think that's one of the spots that a player new to Omaha from Hold'em could easily get wrong. And so to make that point in a Hold'em analogy context, I think is worth it. So anyway, that's a general rule about pocket paired hands, is that you don't like being in 3-bet pots with them. And so you usually, if you're going to be in a 3-bet pot with a pocket pair hand, either if you're 3-betting yourself or calling a 3-bet, you're going to want to have some side cards strength with it. So you want to have connected, queen, queen, jack, 10. You want to be single suited, double suited, 9, 8, 8, 7, double suited, and so forth. These hands are fine in 3-bet pots, particularly when you have position, and certainly great hands to 3-bet with yourself. But they're not. You don't want to be in 3-bet pots with sort of queen, queen, XX. You don't want to be in 3-bet pots also, looking back at your unpaired hands, with sort of disconnected rainbow ace XXX hands, or disconnected rainbow 9864 9864 single suited. Those kind of hands are not good for 3-bet pots. And that's foreshadowing a little bit this next slide, which is the final one of the video. So I'll just click forward and say, talk about each of the kind of key ranges that we want to talk about. Important ranges: early position, late position, opening ranges. I'm going to say some general things about those, thinking through each of the different hand groupings we've talked about, and then talk about some concepts about facing arrays in and out of position, and how your 3-betting and flatting ranges will vary in those two spots. And then also say a little bit about facing a 3-bet, and sort of which hands are good to 3-bet, or sorry, which hands are good to call a 3-bet with, which hands you should fold to a 3-bet, and also what, when you're in a spot where you're being 3-bet a lot by an aggressive 3-better, which hands to 4-bet light. Although that's a pretty complex topic, and one that is mostly going to be sort of brushed aside for this intro video. I don't think we're going to get to into much depth with that, but it is an interesting problem that's getting more and more interesting as people 3-bet wider. I mean, you're getting people 3-betting 10-12% of hands, and in some of the mid-stakes games. And when you get into those types of dynamics, it becomes important to be able to 4-bet light, and also just generally to be able to play in 3-bet pots. All right, so early position opening ranges. Early position opening range I think is more interesting than late position. Although late position, the generalization is, if it's folded to you on the button or the cutoff, you can open a lot of stuff, and you're using your position in a lot of cases, and the distinctions between which types of hands are okay to open, which types of hands aren't, are a little bit less interesting. But in early position, I want to focus back on this idea of playing non-nut hands, not wanting to play non-nut hands out of position. So my recommendations for like a 10 or 12% early position opening range would be, obviously all ace ace XX hands, your sort of strong double suited connected hands, strong double suited Broadway hands, nutty hands, like nutty marginal double suited, single suited, connected type of hands. So hands like ace 8 7 6 single suited to the ace, hands like ace king jack 9 single suited to the ace, probably single suited to the king or the jack, but also but definitely single suited to the ace, and that being sort of a borderline decision when you switch from being suited to the ace to not, largely because of this sort of being out of position and not wanting to be in too many spots with non-nut hands. As far as pocket pairs go, you're going to go from sort of opening all of your aces hands, opening sort of the majority of your king's hands, but probably not the king 7 deuce rainbow type, to opening sort of a decent slice of your queen's hands, more than half, but definitely not close to 100%, and then opening a decent number of jacks and 10s, but not really only jacks and 10s that are connected to the two side cards, or that are double suited. Even like really jagged, like jack 5 deuce double suited, I think is really borderline. And it's a lot of these things we're going to be talking about fractions of a big blind difference, but there's definitely arguments against opening a hand even that good of a pocket jacks hand, a double suited hand. But generally, I would say that pocket pairs then are going to form something like 5, 6, 7% of your opening range under the gun, and then another 7, 8%, something like that. So maybe we're looking at 13, 14, 15. And if you want to tighten up, if you're in a game where you think it's necessary to tighten up, you got tough players behind you, you're going to be dropping some of the big pocket pair hands. I mean, set mining mediocre pocket queens out of position is not going to be nearly as profitable against good players as it is against if you're going to be in lots of multi-way pots against relatively bad opponents. So you drop those hands from your range. You drop some of the some of the sort of less connected single suited hands and so forth. But mostly you're going to be playing premium hands in early position, and you're going to want to sort of weigh those hands towards the nut making hands. In later position, when you're folded two, or when there's a limper or two to you, you're generally going to be comfortable isolating a wider range, or opening a wider range of non-nut hands, so hands like Jack 8, 6, 5 double suited and so forth. And then sort of when you're facing limpers, I think you're going to find this is maybe this is the one interesting thing I can talk about in late position. When you're facing limpers, you're going to have a decision between limping behind, limping behind, raising, and folding. And I would say that something like 90 or 95% of your opening range and again, I'm going to do a hold'em example. 90-95% of your opening range in the cutoff is going to be an open over an isolation over a limper, because most people who open limp in early position, you don't really have to make any adjustments to tighten up your range much, and you basically are just going to ISO them and play from there. And limping behind isn't necessarily going to be a big thing that you do. In PLO, with about 20-25% of your opening hands from late position, it makes more sense to limp behind if somebody has open limped to you, because you don't get as much of a benefit from building a pot even in position. If you have a hand, pocket kings, pocket queens, really dry hand, sometimes it makes sense to raise. But if you know that raising is going to get you a four-way bloated pot where you have to flop a set, or with a dry single suited ace 8, 6 deuce single suited or something like that, you don't necessarily gain anything by putting more money into the pot and building a pot in position. You sort of really want to you can take advantage of, you can see a cheap flop with a nut making hand, basically, is what I'm saying. And with non-nut making hands, you typically don't want to limp behind. You want to either raise or fold. And I would say that out of my opening range from the cutoff or button, I'm probably ISOing something like 60-65% of it. And about half of the rest I'm actually folding if somebody is open limped, because it's not worth it to get into a pot where I know we're going to see a flop. And then the other half or so I'm going to be limping behind. Anyway, that's most of what has to be said about early position, late position opening ranges. Cutoff and button overall, I would say I'd be opening, if it's folded to you, be opening sort of anywhere from 30 to 60 or 70% of hands. They're really trashy, like basically the sort of the looser and sort of more passive your opponents are from the blinds, the more generally the more you can open, but the more you have to be cautious about hands that are really never going to have something strong at showdown, like a dry pocket tens hand or 8, 7, 6 deuce rainbow. Hands like that would still probably be would be folds from cutoff or button against opponents who you think you're going to end up having to see showdown against a decent amount. But of course, if there's somebody who's so tight in the blinds that they fold all the time, and then they check fold the flops that they when they call pre-flop, you can open 100% from the button. And those are just sort of general poker adjustments that that are less interesting to talk about than some of these other broader concepts about what hands we want to be putting ourselves into what positions with. You're just going to be sort of sliding that scale from the top 30% to the top 60 or 70%, depending on how bad your opponents in the blinds are. And also you're going to be adjusting your cutoff range a lot to sort of shying away from hands that don't like to be played out of position when you've got a tough button who's going to flat you and 3-bet you a lot. Clearly you're going to back off on hands that don't like 3-bet pots, be less likely to open mediocre pocket pair hands and so forth from the cutoff when you've got a tough player on the button. But other than that, you're mostly going to be sort of trying to use a position aggressively. You're going to be opening a lot from the cutoff and even more from the button when it's been folded to you. Facing a raise both in and out of position, we've got two main options. Three options. You can fold, but if we've got a hand that we don't want to call with, we're obviously not going to talk too much about. Not as interesting as the decision between whether to 3-bet or flat with a good hand. The first comment I'll make is about which hands we're willing to see a flop with when we're in position that we wouldn't be willing to see a flop with when we're out of position. And this is, again, those non-nut, multiple mediocre component, your Jack 10, 8, 8 double suited, your sort of 10, 7, 6, 4 double suited, single suited Jack 9, 8, 6, hands like that, depending on how good or bad your opponent is, who's raised in front of you, you can be comfortable calling playing position against them with those kinds of hands. But those are hands that you wouldn't want to call with out of position. So those are hands that you don't defend from the blinds, but they're hands that you can be comfortable playing in position. Also, if you already know that you're going to be encouraging a multi-way pot with your call, there's a raise and somebody else has already called, then you're going to weight your range more towards those nutty multi-way pot type of hands. You're going to be more inclined to call with pocket kings, obviously. If you're facing sort of a raise in front of you, you're on the button or in the cutoff, and you can expect to get a multi-way pot. Some of those really polarized non-nutty hands, polarized nutty sort of multi-way pot hands are hands that you would, against a decent opponent, would just fold from the blind. You don't want to set mine from the big blind. You don't want to defend and set mine to pocket jacks, pocket queens, and so forth. You should be more inclined to try to play hands that are comfortable in heads-up pots in those situations, that will do more than just flop a set or nothing. And flop more semi-bluffing possibilities. You need to be able to semi-bluff check raise flops if you're defending the blind from the blinds out of position and so forth. So as far as which hands to 3-bet or not, this is a more interesting question. I would give 2 basic guidelines. Number 1 is to think about the things that I said already earlier in the video about the types of hands that prefer 3-bet pots. So hands that have non-nut components, hands that are strong across the blending of categories of components, have mix of connectedness, suitedness, high card strength, and a blending of different types of flops that they hit hard. So you're looking for hands that flop strong pair plus draw combinations, looking for hands that flop that top quarter, top 25% or so of flops, that they're really strong on those, that they dominate hands in 3-bet pots. The high card suited hands and stuff like that. So you're looking at 3-bet those types of hands as sort of a default from any position, from in or out of position. If you want to 3-bet light, I pretty much would advise only doing it from the button and the cutoff. I don't think 3-betting light out of position accomplishes much. It doesn't put the kind of pressure on your opponent that it doesn't put pressure on your opponent to 3-bet to 10% of stacks in PLO when they have position on you. And so to consistently 3-bet with hands that have an equity disadvantage, you're not likely to gain much of that equity disadvantage back, because you were the 3-better who's got initiative and so forth. It's just not, it doesn't work that way in Omaha. But in position, when you've 3-bet, you're going to be able to gain. You're going to be able to gain extra value from all these mediocre hands. And so a hand like I've come back to this hand a few times, Jack 9, 8, 5 double suited, is a really good hand to 3-bet light with against somebody who's an aggressive sort of standard, 25, 18 opening from the cutoff. These are the kind of hands that play really well in 3-bet pots when you have position, that can be comfortable with a range of pair plus draw possibilities. And the only thing you have to be cautious about is not to 3-bet too wide with hands on the lower end of that, like an 8, 6, 5, 4 double suited and so forth. If you're against the kind of an opponent who's going to play for stacks very often, get stacks in pretty loose post flop, you're going to be too often setting yourself up to get it in dominated. Like when you flop non-nut, you flop bottom pair and a non-nut flush draw with 8, 6, 5, 4, and suddenly because you're in a 3-bet pot, you're committed to putting your stack in, and the more likely you have an opponent, the more likely your opponent is to check fold more flops, the looser you're willing to, or the weaker you're willing to 3-bet them. And against an opponent who's going to be playing for stacks a lot, who doesn't fold pre-flop, doesn't fold post-flop, you're going to want to weigh your 3-bet still more towards the value end, and just be sort of a little bit more liberal about what you call a value 3-bet, dropping down to, queen 9. Queen 10, 9, 6 double suited and stuff like that, as opposed to sort of you add that hand in, which you'd be adding probably regardless, but you don't go all the way down to adding 7, 7, 6, 4, stuff like that, which when you're getting check raised a lot on the flop in the 3-bet pot, you're not sort of gaining any bluff value from 3-betting with that hand, even though it could be a deceptive good 3-betting hand against the right opponent. So anyway, that's talking about 3-betting both in and out of position, and there's a lot of concepts, sort of overlapping ideas here, so please, any questions about things that I've said or ways that I phrased it or whatever, drop them into that thread, the thread that's reserved for this video, and I'll try to do sort of I'll try to answer whatever sort of confusion ends up coming out of any ideas, just any general ideas that you think aren't fully explained in this video. So last point, facing a 3-bet. We're going to see sort of a wide range of 3-betting strategies, and one of the easiest ways to break this down is to think of opponents in 2 groups, and one group is gradually becoming, or fast becoming, extinct at the mid-stakes levels. But these are opponents who 3-bet just aces, and their 3-bet stat, if you have Hold'em Manager, which gives that number, will be 2, 2.5, something like that. About 2.5% is the percentage of ace, ace, XX hands. You might see somebody 3-betting like 3%, and you see them 3-bet dry aces a couple of times, and so you know that the majority of their range is aces. Against these opponents, you can be a lot more loose about calling with sort of crappy unpaired hands. Any 4 random cards can almost can be sort of can call a 3-bet preflop and try to outflop aces. The cards you don't want to have in your hand, if somebody often has aces in their 3-betting range, is an ace. You don't want to have ace XXX, and you don't want to have a pocket pair. So if you have that type of an opponent who's 3-betting aces, mostly just aces, and who's stacking off too light with them, you have serious implied odds you can call with just about anything. If you're against opponents who are sort of mostly populating the mid-stakes games now, who are 3-betting a range similar to what I've just been advising to 3-bet, sort of not 3-betting all of the aces hands, not 3-betting very many rainbow hands, mostly 3-betting single-suited, double-suited hands with multiple components, including the very strong hands and sort of the medium-strength hands of that group. You're going to get into some sort of spots that look like you have implied odds, but where you really don't. Like if you're getting 3-bet by somebody who always has aces, you can call with any kind of non-nut pair plus draw flopping combination and get stacks in any time you flop anything, and you're making money by doing it. If they only have strong double-suited hands in their range on the flip side, then you are very consistently going to be flopping dominated pair plus draw and getting stacks in with dominated pair plus draw. And so the hands that you have to drop from your range, the better your opponents get and the better they are about 3-betting and playing in 3-bet pots, are disconnected hands, rainbow hands, and sort of hands with low cards in them. So you're sort of more inclined to be willing to call 3-bets with double-suited hands with like a Broadway card or 2 than with a disconnected 8, 6, 4, 3 double-suited. And usually in position, any double-suited hand is going to be good enough, but especially if you're going to be in a multi-way 3-bet pot, you have to be really careful about those hands, because it's just way too likely that you get it in really bad, especially if you ever get it in 3 ways with a crappy pair plus draw hand. You're very often going to be in really bad shape. So those are the hands that you drop from your calling range. The sort of the better your opponent gets, and also that you're much more inclined to drop those hands from out of position. A lot of those hands, mediocre rainbow hands, are just folds if you get raised from somebody. If you get raised, you raise cutoff, he re-raises button. Any decent opponent, you should be folding 10-9, 8. Now 10-9-7-5 rainbow, 10-9-7-5 single suited, mediocre pocket queens, pocket kings, and so forth. Those hands just don't play well in 3-bet pots out of position, particularly. In position, you can be a bit more liberal, depending on what you expect the opponent to do post flop, and sort of how comfortable you feel playing in position against him. As far as 4-betting light, there's really 3 groups of hands that you can go to first if you're getting 3-bet a lot. Number 1 is ace king king X, ace queen queen X. So these are hands that are particularly nice to 4-bet with in spots where you know your opponent is never going to fold to the 4-bet. He'll only shove if he's got aces, and you can actually, especially if you're a bit deeper than 100 big blinds, you can 4-bet and fold to a shove. And the nice thing about 4-betting with ace king king X, ace queen queen X, is that obviously it's got high card strength, the pocket pair strength, and if he doesn't have aces, pocket kings, pocket queens are nearly as good as aces. Basically, they functionally are the same thing if your opponent has middle connected cards, and in fact, sometimes your queens or kings are more likely to dominate. And obviously having the ace in your hand is a blocker against him having aces. So that's a good hand to 4-bet with. Big Broadway cards for similar reasons. Big double-suited Broadway cards are good hands to 4-bet with. Particularly with an ace, king, ace, king, jack 10, and so forth. And then all the double-suited rundown hands are a bit more of sort of gambly 4-bets. It's the kind of hand that you don't care if you get stacks in. You're a slight dog against aces if that's what happens, like a queen, jack 9, 8 double-suited and so forth. The negative about 4-betting that kind of a hand is that when you call the 3-bet, you're getting some serious sort of positive value out of being able to see the flop and then decide, which you sort of lose by choosing to 4-bet. But there's sort of a lot more that could be said about light 4-betting, and I will try to answer any questions along those lines if you have them. Put them in threads about the video or threads in the Omaha forum. But for now, that'll wrap it up. That's this general overview of pre-flop play. Again, there's tons of concepts. I realize this probably felt like a bit of a rushed video. It felt so to me, partly because I've been doing this material over longer amounts of time. This covers a handful of lessons in my coaching program, and so to sort of condense it all into one lesson, it probably does feel like some things got skipped over and some detail got skipped over. So if you have questions along those lines, please post in a thread, shoot me a PM, whatever, and I'll do my best to answer your questions. All right, that's it.